All right, we have come to the end of our rants for this class. This is recent history. This is ongoing history, and I have to admit it's still kind of confusing, isn't it? So what I want to do here is we'll just go back and we'll talk about how a few of these things come together, and some of the stuff won't make too much sense. We might just skip it. All right, let's see how it goes. Back in 1983, this picture was taken with Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein. When, under George W. Bush, the United States invades Iraq, Donald Rumsfeld becomes, the antagonist to Saddam Hussein, or I should say that these smiling tuxedo-clad gentlemen become enemies. But in 1983, Iraq and Iran are engaged in a war, and Iran had recently had the Islamic Revolution, and they had recently taken over the U.S. Embassy, and so they were not our number one ally. The United States is number one ally, and any enemy of our enemy is our friend. Oh, by the way, Afghanistan's over here, right here. Pay attention to that. So, the United States begins assisting Iraq to invade or to fight Iran, also supplying them with weapons, interestingly enough. Around the same time period, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. And guess what? The enemy of our enemy is our friend. So the United States starts aiding the Mujahideen who were fighting against the Soviets. And at that point in the Cold War, Islamist freedom fighters and the United States were on the same side of the battle. This is going to change here fairly quickly. George Herbert Walker Bush is elected. He is Ronald Reagan's vice president, and it's a pretty overwhelming electoral victory, and the popular vote is also fairly convincing. So, during George Herbert Walker's administration, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, and with a broad-based UN coalition, the United States, at the lead of this coalition, attacks Iraqi forces in Kuwait, and they are repulsed. So for lots of people at the time, it feels like, yay, 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 we beat the ghost of Vietnam. America has finally won a war, although, as we know, we're not quite done in Iraq yet, are we? It really was a coalition of the willing, by the way. This is for George Herbert Walker Bush. This is a fairly significant foreign policy achievement to be able to do this with so much support. Saddam Hussein is kicked out of Kuwait, and then, just like the UN said, we stop at the border of Iraq, and that's meeting aggression, stopping aggression. That's what the UN is supposed to do. Meanwhile, back in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union has pulled out, the US loses interest, and there's a battle for control over the country. So we get the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, established in 1992. Then there is more sort of civil war and strife, and ultimately the Taliban, which is a fundamentalist Islamist organization, takes control of the country, and they allow Osama bin Laden to return in 1996. He had been one of the foreign Mujahideen freedom fighters, and he bumped around the world for a little while, and his terrorist activities caused governments to not want him to be in their country. So eventually he's kicked out of lots of other places, and he returns to Afghanistan. We'll join that story in just a little while. But real quick, also under Herbert Walker Bush, we get the final, I think, well, not the final, I'm sorry, the penultimate or one of the last legs in the civil rights revolution, and that is the American with Disabilities Act. I love this cartoon because everybody's mad, right? The guy in the wheelchair is mad because he can't get up these crazy stairs. The business owner's mad because now he has to spend a whole bunch of money so this one guy in a wheelchair can get up into his business. And what is he? Is that supposed to be like a barber? Like a barber is going to spend all this money to give a $10 haircut? I guess that's the idea behind that. It's kind of crazy. I don't know that anyone would want to refuse service, right, to someone who's handicapped, and yet this might be seen as government overreach. Now the government's telling you how to run your business. This is a continuing tension in American society between legislating for the common good and that libertarian freedom America that some of us like to talk about. So anyway, 1992 election, Clinton comes into office, and real quickly, we're not going to talk too much about Clinton, but there's a World Trade Center bombing. It's not directly linked to Al Qaeda, but this is 1993. This is not the World Trade Center bombing that you guys are probably more familiar with. There is a Branch Davidian complex raid by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division, and some pregnant women are killed. Some people see this as a gross abuse of federal power. And a year later, some domestic terrorists strike at the federal government in Oklahoma City, blowing up that building. So it seems like maybe that the Tea Party has made American politics more contentious as of late, but American politics have been contentious for a long time. Oh, the bluegrass, we're just going to skip that, but Clinton is Clinton is impeached. However, he is not found guilty because impeachment is a political act after all. We're skipping all that. We're skipping all that. We're skipping to some wars. No. Jeez. Okay, we're skipping to 9/11. 9/11. Terrorists attack the World Trade Center. They attack the Pentagon. And U.S. invades Iraq. U.S. invades Afghanistan. All right, this slide is from 2009, and since that time, we have ramped down the Iraq War. We are ramping down the Afghanistan War. Of course, with ISIS in Syria and Iraq, we have new concerns about Iraq. But, yeah, after 9/11, the United States is involved in 2 foreign wars. Afghanistan is a very tricky place to try and conquer, as the British learned, as the Soviets learned, and as we learned, right? With the Afghanistan war, it's not really a nation in the sense that a nation is a group of homogenous people. It's a spot on the map with lots of diversity, which makes it hard to govern as well. It's also a country that's been invaded repeatedly in the last couple years and been incredibly destabilized. Finally, boy, oh boy, oh boy. At least as of 2009, the U.S. policy was to defeat Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Oh, goodness, goodness, goodness. It's such a confusing world we live in, isn't it? So we invaded a country to attack a terrorist organization that is no longer in that country, and we're attempting as a nation to figure out how to pull out of Afghanistan and yet help it transition to a stable government that wouldn't allow the presence of a terrorist organization. So that's kind of a dicey proposition, and we'll just see how that works out. Islam is a major world religion. It has a political component as well. And so in the next little bit, I'm going to try and talk about that very briefly. This is going to be kind of convoluted. First and foremost, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all come from the same tradition. They all count Abraham as a prophet. They differ as to when this divine revelation ends. Islam is a peaceful religion. It's a religion of social justice. It's a religion of supporting the needy. It's got a component of struggle. There's one idea of struggle where it's the personal struggle to be a better person. And there's another idea of struggle that has to do with fighting against unbelievers, this jihadist struggle. Islam was not a persecuted minority religion when it started. It rose very quickly as a position of power, and so the differences between Christianity and Islam and the political components of it are fairly stark. The other part of this is a real-world geopolitical aspect, and that is that the spread of Islam really got its strongest point, somewhere around 900, let's say. And then after that, starting about 1492, Europe starts to rise as Islam starts to contract. So, there's a power component to this. That there's political movements that Islamist people want to be governed by their own rules, and for them that means a theocracy, and that's a fine thing. In the American tradition, a theocracy is a bad thing. But if people want to have a theocracy, then isn't it democracy to let them have that theocracy? You see what I'm getting at? Maybe a little bit, right? If people vote in Islamic rule and Islamic law, then that's their choice. There's an external and an internal jihad in a radical Islamist sense. So what am I talking about here? Osama bin Laden decided to attack the West to bring about some kind of Islamic law. There are other radical Islamists who want to just create this in their own countries. So there's all kinds of different tensions and interpretations of what political Islam might mean. So we should be careful when we interpret all Islamist activity as a direct threat to the United States, because that's not a universal interpretation of what it means. There's a long history of European domination. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, right? The Ottoman Empire falls, and so those lands are distributed among the European powers: Iraq, Transjordan, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria. All these become European mandates. During that time period, Britain supports the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Then Hitler and the Nazis kill about 6 million Jews, and this idea that the Jews need a place to live where they can govern themselves becomes increasingly important. The UN attempts to solve this problem of of Jewish people moving into a place already occupied by Arabs by partitioning the country. Instead, Israel declares itself a state. There's a series of wars, and I'm going to skip all the way down to here. Alright, so we have physical dispossession, we have political dispossession. In other words, the Palestinians lose land, they lose the ability to have meaningful self-government. Other Arab states view this as a sort of a continued part of European domination. The West is a decadent sexist society in some interpretations. Islam does not want to have those same values. So some people see headscarves and they say, oh, women are being oppressed, and others say, this is our choice. So it's complicated, isn't it? Goodness gracious, my time is done. Enjoy.